Welcome to this meeting of the Scottish Affairs Committee, where we are looking at GB Energy and a just transition. So welcome to our panel this morning, our first panel. If I could ask you both to introduce yourselves and very briefly say your role, please. I'll start with Mr. Leslie. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, good morning. So Julian Leslie, Director of Strategic Energy Planning and Chief Engineer at the National Energy System Operator, responsible for the long-term strategic planning of the whole energy system for Great Britain.
Good morning. So I'm Steve McMahon. I'm Ofgem's Director for Network Price Controls. So I oversee much of our regulatory arrangements for the electricity and gas networks. I'm also based in Scotland, so I help support the operation of the office up in Glasgow, where we've got just over 800 staff.
Thank you both very much, and welcome again to our meeting this morning. If I can just kick off, and this is a question to both of you. I'll start with yourself, Mr. Leslie. What are the main drivers behind the need for upgrades, significant upgrades to Great Britain's electricity grid?
Great. Thank you for the question. And there's two main drivers. The main driver to date has been obviously to sort of move away from coal generation, which we successfully did in October 2024. But also think about the role that gas plays in the energy system. And then we'll respond to the policy directions of the various carbon budgets, but also the Scottish Government's targets for offshore wind, onshore wind and solar. And obviously there's great renewable resource in Scotland. So we've seen a large propensity of developers wanting to connect into Scotland, to take advantage of the ScotWind and the INTOG and the various other sort of Scottish Government policies. They then come through with the connection offer application to the NESO, and then we work with the Scottish transmission organisations to work out what is the most cost-effective and most efficient way to connect that generation. So that drives a lot of the investment and the transmission investment that you're seeing to date to allow that energy to move to where it's needed, which is also in Scotland, to sort of facilitate decarbonisation and the economic growth for Scotland, but also as a GB-wide essential resource to support the decarbonisation of the Great British electricity system. So the other driver, of course, then is the demand side. So demand has been reasonably flat for a number of years, but we're starting to see now demand start to turn as people start to electrify heats and transport, and industry is starting to decarbonise. And we see this trajectory continuing to grow out to 2030 and then really take off between 2030 and 2035 as we get to a secure, low-cost, low-carbon energy system that energy, not only the existing energy users, but it'll attract new energy users such as data centres, hydrogen electrolysis, and create new economic growth opportunities for Scotland.
Would you like to add anything, Mr. McMahon?
Yeah, maybe briefly. So I think Julian's covered the main things. We see three elements. One is the huge amount of renewables that we have to connect. I think that's clear. The second, as Julian said, is in the demand side. If you go across the country, there's lots of customers that are looking to connect in to the electricity grid. So if you've not got that capacity there, then you're delaying those investment decisions, or worse, they go elsewhere. So it's important to have that capacity as well for industry. And I think the third thing is just like the core operation of the network. So we invest, and we have done historically, to make sure that these are maintained to very high standards of reliability and resilience. That's something we've been proud of in this country. And to maintain that, you've got to obviously increase that investment over time. So that would be the third element I would draw out.
Thank you. Mr. Leslie, your organisation has estimated, I understand, that electricity demand could rise by about 11% by 2030. What underpins those projections about rising electricity demand?
Yes, so the way that we forecast electricity demand is to do extensive stakeholder engagement with a whole range of different stakeholders, but also look to government policy, so things like the Warm Homes policy that was issued just a few weeks ago, and that sets an ambition for the minimum of air source heat pumps, for example, but also working with the motor industry to work on their projections on EV take-up, as well as then working with industry, and through our new regional energy strategic planning processes, getting engaged with local regions and local industry to understand what their decarbonisation plans are. That all comes together, and then we were able to make those load forecasts out to 2030 and much further beyond, and we are moving to a much more strategically planned system. So we are looking now fully out to 2050, and then working back from 2050 to say, well, if that's where we're ending up, what do you need to do now in that context? And we've seen already, last year, the electricity demand last year, for the first time since, well, for a very long time actually, I can't remember quite when, increased by just under 5% when you look at it across the year. So we're starting to see this growth of electricity consumption on the system already.
And presumably you take account of things like planning regulations that mandate the use of heat pumps and the like.
Yes, absolutely.
Well.
All of those policy decisions feed into this, as well as alongside the other side of this, of course, is energy efficiency programs as well, and how we, and as there's still a lot of the consumers out there transitioning from filament bulbs to LED bulbs. Your A-rated appliance today is far more efficient than an A-rated appliance even 4 or 5 years ago. So there's a counterbalance. Our consumption demand is sort of falling whilst we're then buying new technologies, which then increases.
Interesting. I think there's a supplementary specifically on that.
Yes, it is, Chair. Thanks. Mr Leslie, how long have you been involved in strategic planning within NESO?
So I've been with NESO or its predecessors since 1989.
Oh, right. So you'll be well placed to understand how we've got where we've got then in terms of grid planning and infrastructure.
Yes.
Okay. Why is it then that we have a massive mismatch between generation and transmission in GB? Whose fault is that?
So in 2010, there was a requirement and a need that government recognised we needed to push for a renewable low carbon future, and at the time we had a 20 gigawatt of renewable target by 2020. With the planning process and the ability to build the network, there's something called Connect and Manage, a government-led policy that came into place which allowed the generation to connect, and we would manage the outcome. And that has worked tremendously well for a long period of time. We've met the renewable targets, and we wouldn't be in the position we are in as a nation today without Connect and Manage.
So talk to me then about the success involved in the amount of money that bill payers have to pay in abatement charges, and then to replace the renewable energy that's turned off from abatement with dispatchable power from gas.
So this was all recognised as part of that policy that we'd be in this position. Obviously, we have been working with Ofgem as the regulator to understand what is the network investment required and by when. Those total constraintless balancing costs, they account for 3.6% of the energy bill for GB. So although it looks a lot in terms of pounds and pence and individually, but in the grand scheme of the energy bill, it's still a very, very low proportion.
Does that percentage include the gas that you then have to introduce to replace the renewables?
It does, yes. And obviously there are plans now, and the regulators approved all of the plans. We've got 88 major grid reinforcements that are coming between now and 2030, and that will get those constraint costs back down to a level. And then with the strategic planning and the Ofgem new anticipated strategic transmission investments, are able to sort of give the transmission owners that clear signal to invest ahead of need, a strategic need. We will get on the front foot as we get to 2030 and beyond. But the constraint cost today is such a small proportion of the overall energy bill. And we still...
But the trouble is, Mr Leslie, is that 3% of an enormous number is still a very big number.
Yeah, so we work very hard. We work with the transmission owners. We work with our market colleagues within NESO to look at other ways we can bridge the gap. But fundamentally, the network is playing catch-up with the amount of generation that's connected. And all of those plans are coming, which is why it's really important that all of the network plans that Scottish and Southern Energy and Scottish Power Transmission have, that they are able to go through the planning process and start the process of being built, because that will then get these constraint costs under control.
I understand that Octopus Energy have questioned whether this scale of investment is actually required. How would you respond to that? I'll put that question to both of you, actually.
Taking the point there, I think if you look back the way, there's no doubt that there was underinvestment in the network. I think we can see that. I think Julian makes the point about strategic planning. That was the key point. The whole system underinvested, I think, in infrastructure. We didn't have a strategic plan, so it wasn't like something existed and we didn't fund it. It was the case that a lot of the individual projects at that time were brought forward by individual developers, individual transmission owners, and there was more of a debate on whether something was needed or not. I think the key question now is how confident can we be? And we've got those plans. So those plans are really clear in terms of where what the market looks like, where your renewables are going to be, and what's the infrastructure that's required to respond to that. We obviously settled the regulatory arrangements for the new transmission price control at the back end of last year, so that comes into effect from the 1st of April. Now, within that, there's quite a lot of adaptability. Yes, we know the projects that need to be delivered, but they will come through a pipeline of investment over the next 5 years in particular, so it can respond and adapt to changing in circumstances. That gives us confidence in terms of, yes, accepting the needs case at the moment, but only approving the actual cost for those projects once they're more developed and once we're sure that it's what the system absolutely needs and at the right price.
Would you like to add, Mr.
Well, I think to answer your question around octopus energy, obviously that was an argument when zonal pricing was a potential. Obviously that is no longer a potential opportunity for GB. So we are working with government on reform national pricing to look at what are those locational levers. But when you look at the scale and the capacity that's required on the network, the yes, encouraging growth of demand in Scotland to decarbonising the whisky distilleries, economic growth, hydrogen electrolysers, bringing all of that to Scotland is the right thing to do for the network, to reform national pricing alongside the strategic planning work that we're doing within NESO. Hopefully the outcome will be the same, that actually we will get that investment in demand growth within the Scottish region, which then negates the constraint costs, but also can avoid or delay some further transmission investment. But we are playing catch-up at the minute, so the network that is currently in plan between now and 2030, there's no regrets. It's a no-regret thing because we're already getting those high constraint costs because the generation is already there or is about to come onto the system.
Coming on to constraint in a little bit, but if you've got a supplementary to that, Angus.
I do. You paint a good picture about how important it is. But I'm the MP for Inverness, Skye and Wester Ross, and the energy sector has lost the support of the people. Our community benefits last year was £9 million. We were told in 2011 this was the Saudi Arabia of renewables. You open your window and you look onto turbines, and yet you're paying 4 times what people in the city are for their gas to heat your house because we're using electricity. So Scotland uses 2.5 gigawatts. We're currently producing 18 gigawatts. So I've seen a figure of 60 gigawatt being in planning. We are producing Britain's electricity, and there's nothing in it for us. And the support of the people in the Highlands has gone. So it's worth you guys bearing in mind, because people down here sit at their desks and they don't realise the downsides of it from people in rural Scotland who are producing our electricity.
Yeah, and I think we absolutely understand the strength of feeling. I mean, I predominantly sit at a desk in Glasgow, and I have been out and about in the country meeting the very people that this infrastructure will impact. And absolutely, we have to understand their perspective. We're building a huge amount of infrastructure in their areas, and fundamentally it's something that they disagree with. But ultimately, we've got a model, and most of our renewable power is in Scotland. We have to be able to move that from Scotland down south. So the key thing for us is respecting those local democratic processes, engaging with stakeholders and communities, engaging with the planning authorities to be realistic in terms of what the options are, to look at what it is that these communities are looking for in return, including community benefits, or indeed in the early work around the siting of the infrastructure, and as far as reasonably possible, reflect that back in the actual engineering and optioneering that we see being brought forward.
I hate to say it, but actually these things just get voted through. So I was in the Highland Council Planning Committee. We may object to a particular line or a substation or a wind farm. It then goes to the Scottish Government and it gets signed off. And so it is not, there is no local democracy on this, in my opinion.
From our point of view, I think we understand that, we respect that process, but the main thing for us is making sure that consumers and the local authorities understand the cost of delay. So when we look at the model we've got at the moment, the constraint cost that Julian set out, that affects everybody, and that has grown over time, and building out this infrastructure will help us reduce those costs. And again, it is about looking at the community benefit scheme that's been set out by government and working to understand, well, how can that be discharged to best effect? Recognising that that won't solve all the problems, but can we do something in return over and above the things that I mentioned in the previous response?
Lane Stewart.
This is for both. So how confident are you that the 80 transmission programmes identified by NESO to meet clean power by 2030 will be delivered on time?
So we set up government DESNES has set up a monitoring process by which we've created a portal where the transmission owners submit all the relevant information into that portal on a monthly basis. We then have regular meetings directly with the transmission owners, with DESNES, Ofgem and ourselves as NESO to understand what the barriers are, if any. And then we get the whole weight of the Clean Power Unit and DESNES to then help then unlock some of those barriers to delivery. So we track every one of those projects, as I said, on a monthly basis. We have a RAG status against those. We understand the risk and the opportunity with those. And a lot of the things that were a barrier, so being able to procure ahead of need, having the strategic transmission investment so the transmission owners have certainty that they're going to get the regulatory funding. So there's been lots of activities, and some of these are responding to the Nick Windsor Transmission Commission's report on the acceleration of transmission infrastructure. So it's a whole raft, 38 core actions that we and government, Ofgem and the transmission owners are working through to ensure delivery.
And maybe just add to that, so from our point of view, Ofgem as the regulator, we're doing everything we can to enable Clean Power 2030. We've approved the significant investment, whether through the ASTI programme that Julian mentioned or the new investment that's coming as part of the next transmission price control. We've got really, really sharp incentives on the transmission owners around delivery. I think recognising that delays will cost consumers, so it's very heavily incentivised around that. We've got the advanced procurement mechanism. One of the big challenges that we have in terms of infrastructure build is just the supply chain. So how can we make sure that we've got this critical equipment that we need to deliver these projects? So last year, we allowed the transmission owners to book that manufacturing capability and capacity in advance, again trying to de-risk those elements of the process. Planning is still a big risk. I think everybody understands that. So that's probably the key outstanding thing. How do we get these projects through the planning system and do that quickly but effectively, I think, in recognition of the community engagement.
On the back of that, what specific upgrades to north and south transmission capacity are urgent to address bottlenecks?
So it's a network, so they're all interconnected. The design that we've pulled together allows you to enable that clean power system in 2030. So there's 88 of these projects that were identified. Some have been delivered already, and we're just working through those. You can't say that any one is more or less important than the other because they all work together in a meshed, integrated grid system. I should say, though, I was going to add to what Steve said, that because of that certainty and the advanced procurement mechanism, the fact we have this longer-term plan, because also we got plans out to 2035, 2036, that companies like Sumitomo investing in Scotland to build a cable manufacturing factory. We've got another cable manufacturing factory near Hunterston, which has got everything ready to go. They're just waiting for an order. So all of these things you can see by giving this longer-term strategic certainty on investment, that it's allowing the transmission owners, the offshore wind farm developers to actually build manufacturing capability in GB. And in these two examples, both of those are in Scotland.
What specific actions do you need the government to take to make the clean energy target by 2030?
From a regulator, I mean, I mentioned all of the things that we are responsible for. There's other elements here that go beyond, like transmission build, for example, long duration energy storage. So we're establishing the regulatory frameworks for that. I think the key ask is probably around the planning system and making sure that these projects can be delivered on time. That would be the key thing for government.
Mary.
Thank you. So, Mr Leslie, £1.5 billion worth of curtailment costs were passed on to consumers last year, and NESO estimates that these costs will continue rising through to 2020. How satisfied are you with the current rate of constraint management?
It's something we take very seriously. As part of the strategic planning, as I say, we've been strategically planning this network for a long time, and we identified a whole range of investments that should be in place by today. However, those aren't for various reasons, planning, consenting, regulatory uncertainty that we used to have 10 years ago, we don't have anymore. So what we've been doing for many years now is looking at alternative ways. So things like we have a local constraint market, so we can look at a local region, see all of the generation and demand that's in there and create a market, so actually people can benefit from taking advantage of the low-cost excess renewable energy. We have demand for constraints, where again we've got a a factory that makes the maltings, where actually they can switch from biomass to electric boiler, again, to manage the constraints, and they get an economic benefit from doing that. We've increased, working with the transmission owners, we've increased our ability to get more power before you get the fault on the system through something called an intertrip scheme. And that, again, is allowing a huge increase in power transfer across the boundary. But ultimately, we need something like another 10 gigawatts, 10,000 megawatts of capacity across that boundary. And these market solutions, the intertrip schemes, are not going to get us that level of capacity that we need. Therefore, the infrastructure requirements are also there, and we have to build the infrastructure.
How confident are you? We keep hearing about 2030, and now we're hearing about some delays that are coming in the planning and delivery of those plans. How confident are you that by 2030 this will get to the place that you're expecting it to get to?
As we said earlier, certainly from a transmission investment point of view, I mean, they've got the whole weight of government, the regulator and NESO to ensure that these projects do get delivered, the supply chain, the skills, the opportunities in place. And companies like SSE and Scottish Power, I've seen them grow and develop their skills base, and SSE got a new office in Aberdeen employing about 3,000 people. So all this is triggering all this economic growth. So we're in the best place possible. The challenge is, though, ultimately is the planning and public acceptability of this infrastructure. But once that planning is done, I have every confidence that the money is in place, the supply chain and the skills are in place in order to deliver these assets.
Just to add to that, I think I'll go back to the incentives point. We have set really, really strong incentives on the transmission companies to deliver this, and it is calibrated against the system value that we get by delivering the infrastructure and reducing those constraint costs.
So, but you have to work within existing policies. We've heard already about community benefit. Do you think that if communities could see more benefit from having the infrastructure and on their doorstep, that would help with some of the potential delays that are coming to building this network?
I think it would, frankly. I think being honest in that conversation, and it goes back to that point about being honest about the costs. So what's the cost if we delay this infrastructure to you individually and to society more generally? I think having that conversation, as well as how we can use the community benefit scheme to greatest effect for these communities, I think that would help to accelerate progress.
So you recognise there's a Scotland-England bottleneck at the moment, and that is, we're just looking, when do you expect that bottleneck to be relieved, and will that then remove some of these constraint costs?
Yeah, so the plan that we have, which we published 2 years ago, which gets you to, 4 years ago, which gets you to 2030, assuming those assets get built and the generation gets built, then the constraint costs get down to a reasonable level you would expect on a network like ours. You would never get to zero, because if you got to zero, you're massively overinvested in the system. However, post-2030, we need to keep going, because there's more. I mean, Scottish Government published just a short while ago an additional 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2040. That's on top of what is already there today. So there's more and more infrastructure going to need to be built in order to collect that great renewable energy from the seas around Scotland and to move it south. And that's what we're responding to as the National Energy System Operator. We'll respond to UK and Scottish and devolved government policies to ensure that our plans align with the devolved government's policies on these things. So there's more. So we'll get to 2030, but we can't stop there. We've got to continue to build more infrastructure, because there's more and more wind coming offshore.
So curtailment costs, do they happen all over the UK, and what proportion of that falls in Scotland?
Question. We can come back to you. My gut feel is it's around 50%, but we can write, Jack, if we can make a note, we can get the details of that.
So, and just finally, what role do you think that community energy schemes have in reducing the demand on the national grid to move power around?
The community energy, I mean, if it's demand side, obviously that helps. So if there's ways in which communities can increase their demand, that helps. And things like the demand for constraints programme of work that we're doing, or these local constraint markets, give the economic signal to do that. We recognise community energy for generation is also something which is critically important because that gets the community buy-in to sort of this transition that we're on. So again, we're working with Scottish Government, Ofgem and the transmission owners to work out what is the process, because it's a policy decision, we're working on the process and then working with government to work out what is the policy regarding community energy and how do we get it onto the system. But obviously for every megawatt of additional community energy that we bring onto the system, triggers or it then uses this infrastructure that we're trying to get built and would exacerbate the constraints currently on the boundary.
Thank you.
Entry from Dave Duggan.
Thanks, Chair. Mr McMahon, in this scenario, you talked about public acceptability. In this scenario, somewhere on the east coast of Scotland, somebody sits in a cold house looking out across the sea at all the wind turbines generating very cheap zero-carbon electricity. And then they look inland and they see the spot that's going to have a really big 400 kilovolt pylon on it. And their radio teleswitch meter is just been switched off. And their smart meter has come in and it doesn't work. And they can't get the energy company to do anything about it. And the energy company blames the people who do the signal for the smart meter. And the people who do the signal for the smart meter blame Ofgem. All of those scenarios are in a regime that your organisation is responsible for regulating. And it looks to many bill payers, not unreasonably I would say, like a regime in failure. What's your anticipated view of how bill payers across GB, not just in Scotland, think Ofgem perform? Do you think bill payers think Ofgem are on their side?
Well, they should, because we are. I think that's the most important point. Every decision that we take, everything that we are responsible for, comes through a consumer lens. We look at what it does for consumers now and in the future. So everything that you mentioned there, where it falls within our regulatory remit, we're trying to improve standards, we're trying to improve the things and the services that consumers get. So whether that be around smart meters, the new arrangements that were put in place last month in terms of like the service standards on suppliers in terms of offering smart meters, and the automatic compensation that would come in place if those standards are not met. On RTS, that's clearly a big issue. We have the switch off in June this year, and there's a managed process.
Is that gone with managed process?
There is a managed process.
Badly managed process.
Well, there's an ongoing process. We had the initial phases last year. It's been carefully managed because we understand like the disproportionate impact on Scotland. Phase 3 of that will start soon when we get the better weather coming, obviously, north of the border. And so making sure that we understand and can manage any implications coming out of the system on that.
If, as you suggest, bill payers should be grateful, and I don't think we should confuse effort with effect. I'm sure Ofgem are busy doing a lot of stuff, whatever that is. But in your scenario, people should be grateful and hold Ofgem in high esteem. But if Ofgem weren't there, how much worse could it be for bill payers? We're already paying the highest energy prices, some of the highest energy prices in Europe, and commercial customers, some of whom are going to the wall because of their energy, are paying the highest commercial energy prices. What difference would it make if Ofgem disappeared overnight?
We are there to protect consumers. We've got lots of things that we do that are protecting consumers now. We see that even through like the price cap and the announcements that were made last week. But the key thing for us is, are we doing the best job we can to protect consumers? Again, it's a legitimate question to ask. I think we understand the affordability challenges that are out there across the country. We speak to customers every month directly to understand their point of view and what more they would expect from us, what we can do for the things that we regulate, so in terms of the supply side, in terms of the network infrastructure. But the best thing that we can do for them, and the best thing that will lower bills, is building out the new system, which is what we're doing. So you see over the last few days, in terms of the volatility that we get in wholesale gas prices because of events in the Middle East, so geopolitical events, when you've got an international market, that, if it's sustained, will have a high impact on prices and exacerbate the situation. So over time, what we are doing now is building a new energy system that will give us more control and will help lower those costs for all consumers, whether they're in Scotland or the rest of GB.
I understand how that sounds a bit jam tomorrow, though, eh?
There is an element of, well, what we can do now, and there was a significant reduction in the price cap.
You're responsible for where we are now.
We are, and if we look back, there's probably decisions that we would have taken differently. I think the decision on investment, for example, is a really good one. In hindsight, we did underinvest in the networks. I mentioned in terms of having a strategic plan. I think that's important. We were able to connect a phenomenal amount of renewables from 2010 to 2020, but the pace of investment never stayed on course with that. So now we're catching up. I think absolutely that is the case.
Thank you.
Supplementary from Kirsten Sullivan.
Mr Leslie, we've heard about the relatively high curtailment costs in Scotland. Now, battery storage sites could have a role in reducing curtailment, but it has been reported that some storage sites have been bypassed or skipped up to 90% of the time. Why is that, and what role do you see battery storage sites having in reducing curtailment costs?
So, it's a really good question. It's a really complex question as well. So batteries generally today are 2 to 4 hours in duration, but the wind profiles that we see are 24, 36 hours. Hence why, as Steve mentioned earlier, the long-duration energy storage is really the answer for curtailment, because they can do 24, well, a minimum of 8, but hopefully 20, 24, 36 hours of storage, so they can cater for the full weather front that's coming across the nation. If you're a 2-hour battery, yes, it helps for the first 2 hours, but then what they do is then try and sell that energy back into the market when it's already constrained off. So actually, in some ways, this then exacerbate the constraint cost because they're full and they want to empty to the cycle again. So it's a really complex situation. In terms of then dispatching them to do that, we are changing the way in which we work in the control room, the tools that we use, the advice tools we provide to the dispatch engineers so that they can dispatch multiple of these devices all at the same time, so they get that big benefit. But again, it's very short-lived, so storage, short-duration storage in Scotland for constraints isn't the answer. It's a short-term answer for a couple of hours, but after that it doesn't provide you much benefit beyond that.
What kind of long-duration energy storage work is underway? That you
Long-duration energy storage, so I mean, Steve might want to come in a moment, but a year, 18 months ago, we went to the market to say, hey, we're looking for some long-duration energy storage. In the Clean Power 2030 plan, we had up to 7,000 megawatts that's required by 2030. So working with Ofgem, working with the industry, we sort of said, hey, here's the technical requirements, submit your applications. So we have a whole mix of new pumped hydro, extension of existing pumped hydro. Also, the cost of lithium-ion batteries is now such that they can move away from just a 2-hour, 4-hour sort of scheme and just put more shipping containers in the field and get to that 8 to 10 hours. So we're just running through that economic, environmental process now. With, I don't know when the decision's going to be made in the next few months. Yeah. There'll be an announcement as to which of there was over 70 projects which were eligible for assessment. A huge oversubscription again, so we're working down on which ones offer best value for the consumers, which ones can actually deliver by 2030 or 2031, and then between, ultimately Ofgem, you make the final decision as to which ones of those.
So we confirmed, I think it was last September, that 77 projects out of the 171 that applied were eligible. I think 23 of those were in Scotland, and that follows the UK government confirmation of the cap and floor regime back in 2024. So now we're establishing the regulatory arrangements. We've done that. We're going through the project assessment, so looking at project costs, the expected revenues and deliverability, and looking at the wider economic benefits as well. And in due course, we'll set out the next phase of the assessment for those.
Thank you.
Yes, MacDonald.
I'm afraid I'm going to come back to this bit about the affordability of energy in rural, not just rural Scotland, but rural Britain. So rural Scotland produces, I would guess, well over 100 times more electricity than it needs. The price of the grid connection is going to go up by £108 by 2031 for the average user. We have the highest level of fuel poverty in Britain, where I live. The standing charges I want to touch on because, Mr. McMahon, I know you guys are doing a pilot on this. As I understand it, standing charges were the cost of taking electricity from, say, the old coal-fired power stations along Gannet up to Wick or wherever. And if it's 67p a day, that is £226 a year. Do you think it is right that people in rural Scotland or the rural Highlands should be paying in order to send electricity down south? Because that's what we're doing. We're paying a lot of money in order to give our electricity to other people. Do you think that's just?
Well, just going back to your numbers, so the £108 that you referenced, so that's the increase in network charges on bills by 2031 as a result of the new regulatory arrangements that we've got coming in from the 1st of April. That doesn't mean that there's going to be £108 extra on bills, so that's the additional network cost. But you get benefits from, as we've been discussing, the lower constraint costs, and also if you get more renewables coming on the system, then that's setting a higher share of the price. So that reduces the wholesale cost. So the net impact we calculate will be about £30, and that fundamentally is building the infrastructure. Now, when it comes to the distributional arrangements, now obviously the market arrangements are set by government. They looked at recently in terms of how they might reform that, in terms of do you move to regional pricing. They decided against it, so we've got to reform national pricing that will progress now. So these we have to work within the arrangements that are set by government. The key thing that we can do is make sure that the costs of the infrastructure are efficient and as far as possible in line with the policy drivers that are set, and making sure that those costs are distributed fairly. You are doing a pilot on standing charges. Standing charges, absolutely. Again, this is a huge issue. Standing charges, it was the biggest ever response that we'd had to any of our consultations. We've got a pilot that will run from April, so it's 4 of the major suppliers, so 150,000 customers. And again, that will give us more information about some of the practical impacts when you reduce standing charges, but you obviously have to recover costs, so you're increasing the unit rate. And is that the right thing for all customers? And we have to do that very carefully, because there could be unintended consequences if you've got a high proportion of low-income customers that might be on electric heat, for example. It might not be the best solution for them. So that's why we're doing the pilot and taking that quite carefully. Do you think there's a case to be made for the areas which generate the electricity to pay lower or zero standing charges? Again, I think we have to work within that policy framework that's set by government. They're the ones that set out how that works and how the charging signals that we have to operate within should be applied in terms of our regulation. Just all seems downside for people in rural areas generating Britain's electricity. Yeah, and I can understand that. I personally live right next to the biggest onshore wind farm in Scotland, in the UK, and I can understand that in terms of the prices that are paid, reflective in terms of where the energy is being produced.
Can I ask you, Mr. Leslie, how do you factor in consumer affordability into your strategic energy planning?
So we weigh up many factors in our strategic energy planning. One of them is economic. So we look at the whole system costs, and you'll see from our Clean Power 2030 analysis, we did look at whole system costs, and we think that the cost of achieving 2030 is roughly neutral. It's roughly what it is today, depending on your assumptions around gas price, which a week ago had been very different to what it would be today. So it is part and parcel. As we say, we look at the transmission owners give us a whole host of options to invest in the network. Our analysis looks at the economics of that, looks at the environmental impacts and the community impacts of those infrastructures. We're playing all this trade-off the whole time. So we have a robust framework and methodology where we have consulted with key stakeholders to understand that methodology, so that when we do come to do our assessments, it is trying to put the right balance of economic, community and environment alongside each other.
We seem to be living in an increasingly volatile world, and geopolitical shocks will have an effect on our energy supply going forward, at least until we get to the point where we're self-sustaining in that regard. Is that something that's factored into your planning, that there could be these unexpected?
So security of supply is the core. It's the thing we never talk about because it's just taken as granted. We would never plan a system where we don't believe that whatever the weather, whatever the geopolitical shocks, we could not operate the system. So that's the beauty of moving to this sort of transition, this energy transition, because we do become much more self-sufficient in our own energy, which isn't subject to the global price in the global market, and is more resilient. So the things that we've done as a system operator to make the system resilient to this low-carbon future, actually what we've realised now, the system is more resilient, more stable today than it's ever been, as proven by an example last year where we lost 4 generation units all at once. If that had happened when the last time we had a big power outage in 2019, we lost 1 million consumers across Britain. for that same fault, the 4 generation outages last year, had we not made the changes we've made, 1 million customers would have been sat in the dark for a while. And it didn't happen. No one noticed outside of the industry because of our embracing the new technologies, embracing batteries to provide very strong, very rapid frequency response, understanding inertia, but also creating new markets for new innovations, many of which are in Scotland. Scotland is the only country in the world that has 5 batteries with grid-forming inverters providing grid stability services. Scotland is the only country in the world that has a dedicated grid stabilising device made in Rugby and GE that's providing grid stability services for the northeast of Scotland. So we're moving all these great sort of innovations, recognising the great resources that Scotland has and the strong political will we've had now for over 20 years to move to this decarbonised future. And we have built and invested in the network in Scotland to make it robust and resilient.
Thank you. Douglas McAllister.
Thank you, Chair. Levels of consumer debt are at their highest since records began. It's now sitting, as I understand it, at 4.4 billion worth of energy debt in the UK. Can you tell me what the figure is for Scotland?
We don't have a figure for Scotland, so you're right in the sense that the number, the total debt in arrears, so arrears being the debt that's not in repayment plans, is just over 4.5 billion now. So that has increased in recent years. Now, the reason that we don't have a figure for Scotland is when we look at our regulatory responsibilities and where we would intervene, it would either be at a market level, which is obviously a national market, or a supplier level. So I don't have a specific figure for Scotland. The best that we would have available, if you look at Consumer Scotland, I think their survey data from last year suggested that 15% of Scottish consumers were in energy debt. I think that equated to around about 380,000 households, but Ofgem doesn't have its own figure.
Why can't you establish the extent of the debt in Scotland? It's a figure, for instance, that the Citizens Advice Bureau in Scotland were interested in obtaining, and they gave evidence to this committee earlier. I think you'd started this hearing by saying you've got an 800-strong workforce in Glasgow or across Scotland, and you're the head of the energy market regulator in Scotland. So is that a figure you can look to establish?
I think we can take that away and look at it. What I can say is that we don't have that just now. Again, it goes down to the way that we regulate the national market or looking at a supplier basis, and there's obviously going to be regional variations to that.
If it's something that you can take away and look at, we would greatly appreciate that. Is that perhaps something that you could provide to this committee in writing in the future?
Follow up. I can't promise that it would be available, but you can certainly follow up in writing. I'll check with my colleagues.
Thank you very much. I understand that you're designing a new debt relief scheme to take effect this year across the UK. Can you explain to the committee what the structure of that will be and how it will be administered?
So, yes, that's been ongoing for some time. I think we're working with government just in terms of the final approval. So what you're effectively looking at here, at least in the first phase, is like dealing with the stock of debt. So a reset around some of that energy debt that's been built up since the energy crisis, in particular for the most vulnerable customers. We are nearing the point where I think we can put those arrangements in place. I can come back to that. The specifics, just in terms of the volume, I think it's around about 300 million plus that it would be worth, and over 200,000 customers across the whole of GB.
300 million. Do average customers across the UK, do they currently pay a sum on their bills that is towards debt recovery costs?
I think this is why debt's important that we deal with it. One is that the impact that it can have on the individual customer that has the debt. I think secondly, just in terms of the operation of the system and the supplier itself. But third is...
the customers who don't have that debt?
Well, exactly. I think the third is that the impacts that it can have on customers that don't carry the debt. So you need to recover the costs, and those costs, like for schemes like this, would be funded through wider energy bills. Yeah.
So at the moment, what's that cost per year to customers who don't have...
I didn't say that, I'm afraid. I'd need
you
to follow
have
up
that figure.
I don't have that.
There's some suggestion it's maybe £60 a year, would that be?
It's not a figure I recognise, but we can follow up in writing on that.
So the new debt relief scheme sounds as if it's going to add more to energy bills.
Well, in principle, the cost would be recovered over the wider consumer base. Yeah,
from all of us?
From all bill-paying customers.
How much then do you think your new scheme is likely to add to our bills if it's almost ready this year?
Yeah, I can't give you a precise figure. It's not something I'm directly involved in at Ofgem.
But you know it might recover 300 million this year.
In terms of the stock of debt, and again we can come back and write with a precise figure, so that would be the stock of debt that would be written off, that's that figure, and the number of customers that would be eligible.
How much of that write-off is added on to consumer bills in the UK?
Well, all of that, so the value that you take off of the debt stock would be added.
Can you work out how much
so
that
would be
spread
over, so we do it through like the network charges, so that it's recovered like over like time, and so I wouldn't want to speculate. I'll come back to you with a precise number.
Right. Okay. 300 million towards 4.4 billion sounds like the tip of the iceberg, a drop in the ocean, and that 4.4 billion is rising.
Well, there will be, but that's not to say that that's the only thing that will be done. I think this is the first phase, and the precise number as well as 300 million. It could be higher than that. I'll confirm that in writing.
So there'll be other things. The 4.4 billion.
So it will reduce that. Then there's a question in terms of like, well, how far do you take over and above that? So this is the first phase in terms of probably those customers that might be on mean tested benefits. There'll be so the rest of the debt stock. You will have elements of that can be recovered through the customers with just sustainable repayment plans. But yeah, clearly it's something that we have to get on top of, and I think that's part of the obligations on suppliers as well, to make sure that they've got early engagement with customers to prevent the actual stock of this debt increasing over time.
It really sounds as if it's the price of energy and making energy more affordable rather than a debt relief write-off scheme. It sounds as if that's really should be the aim.
So there's no question in terms of how that debt's been built up and the increase in energy prices that we've seen since the crisis. You will have some of that debt that's people that can pay that just won't pay, and I think the key is important that we do separate that out.
Thank you.
A brief supplementary, please, from Susan.
It's very quick. So Citizens Advice also mentioned social tariffs. Is any work being done to look at social tariffs?
I think we're on record, and our Chief Exec's on record in terms of our general support for social tariffs, but for us that's something for government. So it's not something we're directly involved in. It would need government to make that determination of whether that's something they wanted to pursue.
Given that the total pricing structure by suppliers is including a payment or is including the cost of the debt, and so debt prevention going forward would seem to be a sensible thing to do, but in the total system that might not necessarily put costs up for everybody if the suppliers were pricing in a way that included a social tariff. So is that
I think that's something that government, I think government would have to make a decision on the introduction of a social tariff, and then for us it would be about how you give effect to any of the regulatory arrangements and obligations that would then fall on the companies themselves.
Elaine Stewart.
So Leslie, NESO published revised timelines for grid connection after missing their January deadline. Why did you miss that deadline?
So we've just gone through a change of a generation. The connection queue, as you know, was 800,000 megawatts when we need about 200,000, so 4 or 5 times oversubscription. Every country in the world is facing a very similar challenge. We are the first to make a change to this. So it's been a massive reform programme with huge impacts across all of the industry. We published on time our sort of revised connection queue in December. And then what's happened then is that then that moves from us to the transmission owners to sort of say, well, here's now the connecting people. They've passed the gate to whole queue process. So now you need to work out what is their connection date, what are the assets to be built, and then they need to send us a contract back to NESO, which will then need to send out to the customer. And I think what we underestimate is just the scale and the challenge of that. And also there have been some surprises in the gate to whole queue in that there is still a 4 times oversubscription on batteries. So we've got 80 gigawatts-ish of batteries in the whole queue when we need about 23,000 megawatts by 2030. So we've spent a bit of time leading up to Christmas and since working out what is our policy position on that, working with the transmission owners to sort of say, how do we treat technologies where there's such a big oversupply, And that has led to just a little delay. So now we're going to publish all the transmission connected offers by mid-April and all the distribution ones by mid-May.
And NESO has also shifted plans so that the offer releases will stagger by area. What are the delay consequences of this approach?
Sorry, repeat the question.
So staggering your connections, what are the delay consequences of this approach if you're staggering your connections across Britain?
Oh, I see. So obviously we're dealing with the ones that need to connect in the short term first. I mean, we got thousands of offers to create, right? We've got rid of thousands. That's what was the whole process, was to get rid of thousands. But when you look at the whole queue still that's left, there's still thousands of offers to be made. So we're doing the right thing by prioritising those which are connecting this year and next year, which is what is coming out by mid-April and mid-May. And we then move on to the next ones, which have got longer, because it's not so pressing, because their connections aren't so late. Their connections are later. So we're just having to prioritise. It's a massive amount of work that we're pushing. We normally take 3 months to do one of these offers. We're trying to do 2 a day currently. So it's just the scale of the change and the implication of what we're doing is just massive. So it's just going to take us time. But that's always been the case. So we've always said it's going to take time to implement.
Christine Sullivan.
Mr Leslie, if I can ask you, what are the most significant impacts of NESO's connections reform on Scotland's community energy sector?
As I said earlier, so we recognise the need for community energy because it gets that buy-in and commitment, as Angus was saying, that buy-in and commitment because people can see the benefits of, and they get closer towards understanding their energy and where their energy comes from. The processing connection reform to date, we've set caps and limits. Well, government has set caps and limits to the Clean Power 2030 action plan. And our connection reform is then saying, well, if you need this much solar, this much onshore wind, offshore wind in those regions, then using the process of connection reform, we've gone down the list and said, yes, you're ready, you're capable of delivery, so you get the connection offer. We're working with Scottish Government, UK Government and Ofgem to think about actually how do we treat community energy schemes because they're generally smaller. And in England and Wales, there's a higher barrier before you get captured by the connection reform process. The network in Scotland is very different. It's been developed for a different purpose. It was developed originally to capture the hydro generation and move it along the valleys, so it doesn't have the same meshed interconnectedness that the rest of England and Wales has, just because of the history where it's come from. So we're working with, as I say, policymakers, with the regulator and the transmission owners and distribution companies in Scotland to understand, well, what is the requirement for community energy? What are those policies and process we need to enable it? And as I said, through our regional energy strategic planning process, which again is new, strategic planning for the first time, looking at the whole system bottom up with the distribution companies. Again, we will be within those communities, understanding what their needs are and how we can feed that through into a strategic plan.
Okay, so can you give me a bit more clarity over the factors that explain why transmission impact assessment thresholds remain significantly lower in Scotland than in England and Wales? And I'm sure you can appreciate it's causing quite a bit of angst in many communities.
And that comes back to the history as to how the network has evolved. So even just as simple as transmission voltage in England and Wales is 400,000 volts and 275,000 volts. In Scotland, it also includes 132,000 volts. So the nature of the network, the way it's evolved over the last 100 years, is very, very different to the one in England and Wales, because it's designed for a specific purpose, capturing small run-of-river hydro in the valleys to then bring it out to where the towns and the cities are. Therefore, it's at a much lower levels of capacity. So just saying, well, anybody just can connect a 5 megawatt community energy scheme into the Scottish network would have a huge impact. Whereas in England and Wales, it has less of an impact just because there's more capacity, just the way the network has evolved over the last 50, 60 years.
Well, we're going to get to a place where the network will have sufficiently evolved again for the thresholds in Scotland to be increased.
That's what we're working with the transmission owners now. Is there something we can do now in the shorter term, as all this infrastructure we've just been talking about this morning, as that comes into play? Actually, the Scottish network is going to look much more like the mesh network of England and Wales, with lots of high-capacity transmission circuits and therefore that will give us the capacity to be able to explore community energy. As I said earlier, though, the network is already full in Scotland. That's driving constraint costs. Every megawatt of additional generation adds to that constraint cost. So we've got to think about the overall cost to consumers also.
Do we have a time frame for that?
Well, it's not all within our control either. It's working with Scottish Government and their policy on community energy, as well as working with the distribution companies and transmission companies.
At a strategic level, do we have an aim, an end date in sight where we can have a bit more
Let me take
parity?
that away and we'll write back to the committee on that.
That's great, thank you. Another source of consternation with the community energy sector has been the fact that they haven't been given a designation status for their projects to get grid connection priority. And we've heard from Golson Estate Trust and other contributors to this inquiry. They're really quite alarmed at that, and it is going to cause them significant delays. Why was that decision taken not to include that mechanism within the connections reform?
Well, it wouldn't be a decision for NESO. I mean, nothing is designated. It's all about cost, technology, location and time of delivery. So nothing has a guaranteed connection to the grid system. If that was the case, that Scottish Government and the regulator and UK Government wanted to make that happen, then that again is a policy decision that we would then apply to our connections process and our strategic planning processes.
Well, I'm fairly confident that this topic will have been raised with the decision makers. Are you saying that there was you're not aware of any conscious process that took place to evaluate whether that was possible or not? And desirable, more to the point?
I didn't run the connection reform process for NESO, so again, we can take that away. But
is that something you could come back on? Because I think it's quite important to understand why that...
Yeah. But one of our core licence objectives is to be non-discriminatory. So we had a connection queue, and people in that connection queue, both at transmission and at distribution, and we had to, and obviously this has been a massive change, as I said, a once in a generational change in the policy and process, and therefore the legal risk and legal challenge has always been at the forefront of all of our minds. And therefore we've had to be very clear on the policy and the application of that to ensure that we have been truly fair and non-discriminatory in our decision making.
Understand that. At the same time, we've got the government coming out with the local power plan, and obviously community energy is central to that. So I'm seeing a little bit of a disconnect here.
I'm not sure there's a disconnect. I think Julian's right in the sense that the technology capacities are set by the UK government, and I think when it comes to community energy, first you would need to define what's exactly meant by community energy, the parameters around that. And then, secondly, how do you reflect that into the capacity requirements? Now, I think I've heard, and obviously the local power plan has been published by the UK government. I think they're working closely with GB Energy around the implementation of that. We certainly, from a regulatory perspective, could help facilitate further changes to connections. But first of all, we'd need the UK government to recognise and prioritise these new categories and the technology requirements that they set out.
Okay. SSEN told us that designating community energy is crucial to achieving the government's target of 8 gigawatts of community-owned power by 2030. What is your view of that assessment?
I mean, from our point of view, like any participant in the market, what we care about is consumer outcomes, and we care about any participant fulfilling their obligations. Now, if community energy can help reduce costs and it can help contribute to wider environmental targets, for example, and decarbonisation, we can support it, but only within, I think, the remit of our existing regulatory arrangements.
Also, you need to, as we've talked a lot about this morning, though, 8,000 megawatts. The peak demand for 1/2 an hour in Scotland is 5,000. The rest of the year, it's about 2.5, as Angus said earlier. So if you're adding another 8,000 megawatts of generation into Scotland, on top of the 40,000 megawatts of offshore wind, on top of onshore wind also, then you're exacerbating the constraint costs, and you need more infrastructure to export power.
Okay.
Unless you have this huge economic growth within hydrogen electrolysis, data centres, decarbonisation of industry, which is the opportunity that this affords Scotland to do all of that.
So basically the infrastructure has to match the ambitions that we're hoping will be delivered. Yeah. Okay, and just one final thing. Community Energy Scotland has called for the presumption that community energy projects are guaranteed grid access at the end of their asset's lifetime. And again, this has been brought up by other parties as well. What's your view on the feasibility of this?
Well, as long as they're paid, so it's an evergreen right, so transmission entry capacity. I'd have to check at distribution, but certainly a transmission, it's an evergreen right, so as long as you're paying your annual charge for connection and you're not exceeding your capacity limit, you need to inform us. But if you've got 10 turbines at 2 megawatts today, you want to repower with 5 turbines at, well, I've forgotten the maths now, whatever the number is, so your total export is still the same, then repowering is not a problem. I'd have to check a distribution.
Yeah, I'd need to check that as well.
I guess the problem is if they're bringing higher capacity or something that has a larger demand because technology's moved on, that's perhaps where the issue is.
Yeah, I'll take that away and have a look at it from our point of view as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Leslie, Mr. McMahon, that's the end of our questions to you this morning. Thank you very much for your contribution. It's been extremely helpful, and we're grateful to you for making the time to be with us today. Thank you very much. Order. To resume with our second panel of the morning, and I'd like to welcome the witnesses here this morning. Could I start with you, Mr. Somerville? Ask you all to introduce yourselves very briefly and what you do. Thank you.
Morning. I'm Scott Somerville. I'm the Director of External Affairs at E.ON. So we're an energy supplier, so looking after, across the whole of the UK, around 5.5 million customers, which includes about 370,000 businesses. So in terms of Scotland, that equates down to about 250,000 customers, so about 1 in 10 homes. And then we've got about 5% of the business market.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm James Basden. I'm a founder and director of Zenobe. We started Zenobe in 2017, really around the theme of making clean power accessible in the two most polluting sectors, being power and transport. Today, we are the largest owner and operator of grid-scale battery storage on the transmission networks in the UK, primarily in Scotland. And as Julian Leslie explained earlier, we provide stability services, so inertia and so on, about 90% of that in Scotland. Most of our batteries are actually on Scottish Power's networks. We also have an electric vehicle fleet business about electrifying buses and trucks, and we have about 40% of the electric bus fleet in Scotland as well. And we have a Second Life battery business, which is all about repurposing batteries when they come off their vehicles. From starting to get sort of friends and family involved to try and get this business off the ground 8 years ago, we've now raised 2.7 billion into the business, and we've invested over £1 billion into Scotland in the last 4 years.
Fantastic.
Hi, Guy Jefferson. I'm the Managing Director of the Transmission Business in SP Energy Networks. I'm responsible for delivering the investments over the next 5 to 10 years to deliver CP 2030, initially in central Scotland. Our patch covers, I always talk about the diagonal between Stranraer and St Andrews, so the central belt of Scotland. We have a huge challenge, great opportunity to deliver £11 billion worth of expenditure to reinforce the network and bring the infrastructure required to deliver that CP 2030 challenge that government has set us.
Thank you very much. I'll begin with Mr Basden, but this question's to all of you really. How confident are you of the overall deliverability of the planned grid upgrades within the expected timelines?
I would use the phrase ambitious. In all honesty, I think it is very worthwhile, but I think the challenge of delivering CP30 is huge. Some of the things from our perspective, grid reform connections reform has been a good thing, but it has put considerable delay. And what you are seeing right the way across the network is projects being delayed to 28, 29, 30. So there's a huge bubble in that time period that really means that it is very, very difficult to deliver. And so whilst it's admirable that we are pushing for this, I think the government has got a huge challenge, and I think both NESO, and we'll come on probably to talk about NESO's challenges associated with 2030, and Ofgem have got some big challenges ahead.
Somerville?
I think, and absolutely answering the question, I think the grid's an important topic and one we have to talk about, and there's no question that investment in infrastructure at that level is required. But I think too often in the energy sector, we're talking about big projects. And, you know, if I think about our customers, whether in Scotland or other parts of the UK, those are the people that need the benefits of the transition, not in 2030, not in 2035, but today. And I think what we're showing is that through consumer energy flexibility, you can, of course, manage that transition, first and foremost, really importantly, from that customer, from that business perspective, which is to save them money today. And that means looking at everything from the traditional topics like insulation, but also talking about batteries, time of use tariffs, battery assets that we can steer. And again, we'll talk about big grid-scaled batteries, but if I just think about a project we've just launched in Glasgow to try and work with children who are living in poverty, so targeting working with the City Council there to really make a difference, delivering savings with a battery that we control and save, but we're guaranteeing savings to those families of around £400 a year. And that's an energy transition story about flexibility, about innovation, but it's about benefits today. And if we all know that energy is currently too unaffordable for too many people, that's the difference. So yes, we need grids investment across the top. But if we think about what we're doing in homes, if we think about what we're doing in business, then perhaps some of the investment at the top of the chain doesn't need to flow through to consumers picking up that bill. So there's a benefit in terms of reducing cost constraint payments, and then there's a benefit in terms of pounds in people's pockets. So absolutely we do need to invest in grids, but as a company that's involved every day with millions of people across the whole country, and as I say, about 1 in 10 households in Scotland, that's where we think the biggest difference can be made.
Mr Jefferson?
So I remain optimistic. I would agree with James that it's challenging. And there are a number of risks that we need to mitigate, but we believe that from a transmission delivery perspective, we can deliver against the expectations of our customers, Ofgem and DESNES. I'd probably say there are 4 specific challenges. Supply chain is obviously stretched, and we use the same supply chain as James does in his area, and we need to try and make sure that that's developed, and we are giving support to that supply chain to allow them to deliver what they need to deliver. That's within our power, and we've already made great strides on that, so there is confidence we can mitigate that risk. Skills and resources, obviously we need a lot of people. Across UK, I think 140,000 in total if you look at both the TOs and the supply chain to deliver against this by 2030. We've made a good start to that. We're all working together, which I think is really important in this. Myself, colleagues from SSE, colleagues from National Grid, DESNES, Ofgem, and colleagues from the supply chain, all working together to develop those resources and bring those resources in that will deliver against that challenge. So again, it's a risk, it's a challenge, but I believe we have good plans in place to mitigate that. System access, I think the previous panel talked about reliability, security of supply, which we're very proud of in our industry, that we provide a fantastic service in terms of 99.999% reliability. We do not want to compromise that, so we need to make sure that the plans we need and the outages we need to take in order to connect new infrastructure are deliverable, and we're working on that again with our colleagues in NESO and Ofgem to make sure that's achievable. And the last one, where I think the previous panel talked also, where they see the biggest risk is in consents and land reform. Again, progress being made with the the Planning and Infrastructure Act that went through Parliament at the back end of last year, which was positive in terms of picking up on a number of points that we've been putting forward for some time to allow us to move forward quicker in Scotland in particular. But there's more work needs to be done on land reform, and there's more work that needs to do to bring some of those commitments in the Planning and Infrastructure Act through Scottish Parliament, and we need a timetable for the legislation that we need in Scotland to enact a number of the things that came through on that Act. So again, confident, but there are significant risks in there.
Okay, I think Mr Somerville and Mr Jefferson have answered this question, so I'll maybe just put it to you then, Mr Basden. Do you think that Ofgem and NESO have accurately judged the level and pace of grid upgrades needed?
I started this business because in 2016 it was pretty self-evident to me that if you build a lot of offshore wind up in the North Sea and you need to connect that into a transmission network, and that transmission network isn't yet prepared, or neither the regulator is really putting pressure on that as to what the demand is going to be, that you will need other assets on the grid to provide the flexibility that you require with intermittent renewables, but also that the grid just doesn't have the capacity to move that amount of power. And we forecast in 2016 that the cost of that would be about £2.5 billion, which is frankly not very far off where it is today. So I think we have been very slow to move. I understand that the grid is a complex system, but what we really need to do is to be designing our grid and our transmission network for what we require in the future. And the pace of technology change is tremendous. It's very exciting. Batteries, for example, in 2016 were scarcely viable. Today they really are probably the most efficient form of flexibility on the grid. But we have to look forwards, and historically we haven't been good enough at that. And it hasn't been, frankly, easy for the transmission operators necessarily to do that, because it hasn't been a big enough element of their regulated return. So they haven't really been incentivised enough about looking forwards. And an illustration is that it would make a lot of sense. It's difficult, I understand, but it would have made a lot of sense to build more of an offshore transmission grid to move the power from Scotland down to England. Now, there are two eastern links going from 2930 at the moment, which actually Scottish Power and National Grid are doing together, for example. But we needed those things earlier, frankly, and that would have reduced the amount of curtailment costs that consumers have to bear today.
But are we now on the right track, given the technology we know about, the technology we have?
I think we've got much better understanding as to what's required. So yes, I think things are significantly better than they were 10 years ago. I think there is always a dilemma about how much investment you put in, and one of our concerns would be that there is overbuild of renewable assets put onto the grid and overbuild of transmission network, because what NESO is starting to do is a spatial energy plan, which is due to come out next year, which actually says this is where we need these assets, so for example, offshore wind, and this is where we can connect it and how we can get it to demand. So next year we'll have greater clarity on that, but that's 2027, and that will set the future for the next decade or so.
Okay. Elaine Stewart.
This is for everyone. In your view, what actions, if any, do you need the government, NESO or Ofgem to make clean energy by 2030 genuinely achievable? I'll start with the optimistic Mr. Jones.
So, to repeat that, I remain optimistic that we can deliver. I've always laid out the challenges in my previous answer. In terms of, I've got to give credit where credit's due, and I think Steve mentioned it from Ofgem in the previous discussion. I think Ofgem have opened the door to mechanisms which weren't there before in terms of advanced purchasing mechanisms that allows us to mitigate the supply chain issue that we had and book manufacturing slots in advance, and they're prepared to fund that cost in a reasonable way. So I think from a supply chain perspective, we've definitely been heard. We've been heard in landing consents in terms of some of the conditions that went into the Act of Parliament that went through at the end of the year. But probably the one area where we do have significant concerns is land reform. We're working with DESNZ at the moment. We've promoted 12 priority measures with regard to land reform, and DESNZ has picked up 4 of them. But one of the key ones for us is the ability to purchase land in an efficient and continuous basis to allow us to deliver against our CP 2030 obligations. So the other utilities in Scotland, whether that be gas, telecoms or water, have a process called notice to install, which allows a kind of 3-stage process. They have to demonstrate that they are going through a voluntary process with the landowner to come to an agreement. If that's exhausted, then they can then apply for a notice to install, which gives an appropriate timescale, which gives the landowner appropriate notification of time and when we need to do that. And then after that notice to install is complete, we undertake to make sure that there's fair compensation after that. It's a process which is in place for the other utilities, and we've promoted that as potentially a solution for electricity to allow us to deliver on the 2030 timescales. At the moment, we rely on compulsory purchase orders, which is a very long process. An example being in the southwest of Scotland, we currently have a scheme which has received consents, 132 kV substation and overhead line. It's received consent from a Section 37 perspective, but we now have to purchase the land associated with it, and we have been in that process since 2024, and it's currently with Scottish Government with regard to the conclusion of a judicial review. So we are almost 2 years on, and we're no further forward with delivering that. And that gives an example of the kind of timescales we're talking about and the delay that could put into some of the schemes that we have. So I'd say that specifically is one area where we do need support from government and Ofgem.
Just maybe, I think Guy's covered a lot of good points, so this is maybe slightly a different point. Firstly, I think I'd like to say that there's a lot of things that NESO is doing that are actually really very good in terms of opening up new services around providing inertia, reactive power and so on. And on a global scale, they really are at the forefront compared to other system operators. So there is credit where it's due. One of the significant things, however, and I think you raised it in the previous panel, is around not using battery storage when it's actually in merit, so skipping, as you said. So this is a situation where we, for example, would have a battery that is available to take the power off the grid, but instead of doing that, the system operator curtails the wind farm and brings up gas, for example, in another part of the country to balance the grid. This puts much more cost onto the system, but is also environmentally not a good thing to do. This is happening on some of our sites, particularly skips behind a constraint, 80 to 90% of the time. So we are available. And just to give you an indication, last year, just on 2 of our sites, Wishaw and Black Hillock, we were available to absorb power off the grid and prevent this curtailment for 271 gigawatt hours. That's the equivalent of providing power for 100,000 homes, okay, or the city of Aberdeen, roughly. So this is a really significant problem. As Julian Leslie explained, it is complex. However, the pace and the attention that is put into this, and he also said it's a small amount relative to the overall cost, but the absolute number is a very large number. And it has a really negative impact on battery storage in Scotland, because we build sites, obviously, with a forecast economic return and a usage rate. And if you are being skipped 80% of the time, it has a negative impact on us, but it has a negative impact on consumers as well, because they're paying much more. And the problem with that is then we build out more assets than we actually require, and more transmission lines, for example, than we require. So I think this issue around addressing skips is something that is doable in a short time frame, and would make a difference to delivering the 2030 results.
Yeah, and Clean Power 2030 is a hugely important mission, and it's one we absolutely support. But again, so I'd echo a lot of the points that are made. I think what we've got to make sure we do is that we focus on, if I maybe put it as, we've got to think big, but delivery needs to be at a small scale. So as I've touched on, that's about, as we discussed earlier, it's your constituents. It's, in order to, get the permission, if you will, for making the investments we need at a national infrastructure level, we've got to take people with us. And I say that, with as a customer-facing business. So we've got to show the benefits quicker. We can do that, but it's about making sure that, individual aspects and technologies aren't overlooked because there's a bigger prize over here. So GB Energy, for example, do an awful lot of great work. It's great that there's such large sums being invested, but let's make sure that as part of that plan there is a role for consumer flexibility. There's an investment in domestic batteries, in smaller batteries for business, so that all of the different bits of innovation, all of the way that energy has become a digital service can be unleashed. And that's not a esoteric point around kind of a concept, and isn't it great we're in the modern age. As I say, that's the only way you will tackle energy unaffordability on the long run. And again, just touching on that, there's more that needs to be done to help people who are struggling. I'm sure we'll touch on that. But for Clean Power 2030, we've got to make sure that every lever we can pull is pulled. And it's not just, as important as they are, about the huge big ticket items. The individual pieces that can sometimes get overlooked, they add up to so much. Just one project to briefly touch on, a solar sharing community energy project that we've got running. One school happens to be in London, but it's a couple of hundred panels on that school. Generates enough energy to power 34 homes. And what we've set up, working around the Ofgem rules, is an innovative approach whereby local residents can share in that solar output, so that you can reduce the load on the grid, but also the transmission and distribution costs that are there as well. So that's generating money. And again, if you think from a Scottish perspective, there's a couple of thousand primary schools in Scotland. If you replicated that, think about A, the benefit that we can deliver to local communities, but B, the cost savings that then come through from looking at infrastructure by adding pieces together. And that's, I think, what energy, we talk about consumer flexibility. It's not just about an individual battery. It's about the work we do as E.ON Next to have the software running in the background that does the thinking, if you will, and you essentially create a virtual power plant. So where we have all talked about coal-fired, gas-fired generation, when I started working in energy 15 years ago, it was, build the generation, connect it up, and then, there'll always be the demand there. We've got to look at it the other way around now. That's the only way we're going to tackle the problem with unaffordability.
It's great to hear that, because that innovation is actually happening in Ayr just now, and they're actually selling the electricity back to the schools, and and the community's getting the benefit out of that. So it's really great to hear that innovative things are happening. I would be keen to see about the stuff within Glasgow, within the houses. Is it battery storage?
Yeah, of course. So look, if just for a second, if I talk about the evolution of it. So, projects we've got across the country, and I promise I will land on Glasgow. But if I just talk through the evolution of it. So.
Sorry, actually, I would have to interrupt you, Mr. Somerville. We're really beginning to get a bit short of time, so if you could...
I can do it briefly, of course I will. So, look, we'll absolutely follow up in writing with greater detail. But I think what, as I'll just cover in the next 30 seconds, we're working with cities across the UK. So, one example I'll pull out is in Coventry, and that's where we combined debt relief. So these are households that are struggling. So what's important is debt relief right off their debt, give them a level playing field, because as we heard in the previous session, unsustainable levels there. So address that. Insulate the home, make sure energy efficient appliances are in the home, but provide a battery and a time of use tariff. So that's where it's cheaper overnight. We're seeing savings of £300 there for people. If you're medically dependent in that household, it can be up to about £650, £700, obviously as a higher user. The next phase of trials, and this takes me on to Glasgow, where we're working, it's a battery. Now, this is an asset, we talk about a steerable asset. So we provide a guaranteed payment to the household of £40 a month. We provide the battery, we retain the ownership, but they get the benefit, 100% of that benefit we've calculated. So they're saving, as I say, we give them a bill credit, £40, they get the benefit. The wider system benefit is we can trade that power, we can, to the flexibility point, we can reduce the burden on the network. And that, again, is targeting households with the City Council for children that are living in poverty. The really important part of that project, as well as the technology and the approach, we're using City Council, DWP and charity sector data. We know where people who are struggling are. Too often there's too many blockers. So yes, it's the technology, but it is also about getting that data sharing in action that makes a difference.
Thank you. I would be interested in getting some more information on that, Ian. So on to my next question is, to what extent NESO's connection reform has struck the right balance to provide a manageable queue without holding back valuable projects?
We've obviously been involved in working with NESO, as Julian commented on the previous panel. There's no doubt that it's made a significant difference. As he said, about 800 gigawatts of either contracted or connected generation was an unmanageable situation. In reality, they've halved that through the reform, and I think that's right. Again, we're still at a point where we are still issuing new contracts to those customers. There is a degree of frustration from that customer base in terms of the time it's taken. And from our perspective, the quicker we understand the impact of the new queue on our system, the quicker we can finalise our projects and get out and deliver them. So I think this is about, the genesis or the answer to all of my questions is about pace. I think it struck the right balance. Has it taken too long? Potentially, but we need to get it right. I take that point. And it's now about cracking on, delivering the new contracts to the customers and making sure we understand the impact of any changes that have been requested.
Just building on Guy, I think, and as Julian Leslie said, they needed to be more draconian and much faster. There are still far too many projects in the queue, and many of those projects are not financeable and not actually required on the grid. We have what were classed as protected connections, i.e. 2026 connections. Some of them have been put back to 2029. And just to understand the impact, so on a local community that is concerned about a large battery, for example, connecting in that community, that just adds another 3 years. We typically may have committed tens of millions of pounds of equity into a project that is now going to be delayed quite considerably, has a material impact on returns. And it provides a lot more uncertainty, frankly, for the transmission operators who equally have to commit forwards with long lead items without certainty around a connection date. So, yes, it does have a significant impact. But, I'm glad that we've done it. I just think we needed to be more draconian and cut a lot more projects out.
And I think flexibility is the answer, as we've talked about. You've got to make sure you pull every lever. It's great that the queue is being looked at, but let's look at what other ways there are as well. So if you can expedite those projects that have a real chance and will develop, we should be looking at that basis, making sure that there's real customer and business benefit. You know, at the end of the day, there's an end user. We've got to make sure that through the whole energy system, it's not just those at the top that are extracting the value. It has to be felt at a customer and a community level, as we've touched on. And again, so the queue's good, it's being expedited, but let's make sure we're absolutely not leaving any stone unturned in terms of those, I'll put it as smaller levers, but they're, you know, they add up to an even bigger total than the queue.
Jane Sullivan.
I had a few questions around constraint management, but I think we've spoken about that quite extensively and the need for flexibility and looking at other options, including batteries. So I'll just ask very briefly, what approaches do you think would most effectively reduce network congestion whilst keeping costs down for consumers? Because that's absolutely critical.
So, two things, and Julian Leslie mentioned them. I would suggest that they need a lot more time, focus and urgency. One is around intertrip schemes, which enables you to move power between different parts of the grid. And the second thing is that there is a constraints collaboration working group run by NESO and supported by the transmission operators and about 30 people from the industry. We are involved with it, and I would suggest that it is moving at an exceptionally slow pace. And it just needs focus and drive. There are solutions there. There are plenty of solutions there, but we need to get NESO on the front foot around these things. And that would materially move things in a 12-month time frame.
Okay.
Just one comment on that. And I think one of the panel talked about jam tomorrow, and I guess it is, but we now have a clear plan, a clear strategic plan for the next 5 years, and beyond that, with some of the bigger projects we've been allowed to move forward with. We just need to get on and deliver that, because that will deliver in Scotland a saving of about we estimate about £4.9 billion of constraint costs, which is the equivalent of £167 per customer, if we can deliver all that infrastructure change over the next 5 to 6 years. So yes, it is jam tomorrow, but I think it's a sustainable long-term investment for us. It makes a sustainable difference to customers' bills.
If there had been that investment a number of years ago, we wouldn't have had to be looking at it as a matter of urgency now. We should have had that before now.
So we have been lobbying for a number of years to have investment, anticipatory investment before this, but I think to be fair and balanced, I think the horizon or the context has changed considerably over the last 5 to 6 years. So where there has been a reaction, and it's easy to look backwards, we're all good at that. I think given the changes that have happened recently, what's more important is looking forward, and what we have now is the right plan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Elaine Stewart.
Mr Basden, this is for you. What regulatory or policy changes would allow storage providers to reduce network congestion at lower cost to consumers?
I think the congestion, which is what batteries are terrific at resolving, the biggest change that would happen is, I'm afraid, what I talked about before, which is having the assets dispatched when they are in order. One of the things that Julian Leslie talked about was battery assets lasting 2 to 4 hours, for example, and so being able to resolve a constraint on the grid for that length of time. It depends how you want to look at a battery asset. In 2028, we will have a 400 megawatt hour battery. You could say that that's a 100 megawatt hour 16-hour battery, or a 50 megawatt 32-hour battery. We have lots of flexibility in how you can actually use a battery, and that's not really taken into consideration enough. But the biggest single thing would be to use the assets when they're in merit order, and to treat battery storage, frankly, like any other asset. And another little example might be, you may know that the balancing mechanism we distribute in 30-minute section settlement periods. What can happen is that gas assets are given notice a long time early because they need time to get warm and to get ready to put power on the grid. A battery can put power on the grid in less than 100 milliseconds. And so what happens is that gas assets get given notification that they will be dispatched, and batteries are left to wait on the off chance that there may be a shortfall. So instead of getting, for example, something which would cover the opportunity cost to us, what's happening is slower, older, more polluting technology is being prioritised over new emission-free technology, and that also has a significant impact on costs.
That comes back to that skipping process.
It does, but it's essentially what there's another thing, for example, at the moment, which is changing. But NESO says that they can't dispatch batteries for more than 30 minutes because they don't know what the state of charge of a battery is. They don't ask a gas peaker how much gas do they have in reserve. We just want to be able to work on the grid for the length of time that is available and required. And if we can't dispatch, then we should suffer penalties. But just treat battery storage as an equal to every other generation asset that's on the grid.
Thank you.
Angus MacDonald.
Thank you very much. I understand the SSEN and how they operate in the Highlands, and I'm less informed about Scottish Power, but give me a hearing. So if you are in Ayrshire and you're having transmission lines put up and you've got wind farms everywhere and you're feeling there's nothing in it for you, and you Googled, like I just have, Scottish Power Energy, you will see that they have got £12 billion of capital investment planned. And you will also discover that their community benefits is £7.8 million. Now, that's not 1%, and it's not 0.1%, but it's 0.065%. So they're importing the teams of workers. They're not using local workers often, and you're using modular housing rather than leaving legacy housing, or this is certainly what's happening in the Highlands in a huge scale. Can you understand why there's quite a lot of resentment against the transmission line and the major onshore wind operators in rural Scotland?
I can understand it, absolutely. Just in terms of the numbers, I think the 7.8 million that you talk about is the first release, if you like, of our community benefits programme. We expect against that 12 billion to have about 250 million of community benefits overall over that complete period. So that 7.8 is just the first phase. No, that's fine. And we've already engaged with our local communities on that, specifically where there is a build-up of assets. I think when we talk to our communities, one-off lines, etc., are still concerning to some, but it's where there are hubs of activity. For example, in East Lothian, where we have a converter station, which is the termination point for our HVDC subsea link, and a large substation that it connects to in a relatively small area. That attracts developers like Zenobe and other renewable developers to that hub as well. So you could have 3 or 4 different renewable developers in the same place, as well as a couple of big installations for SP Energy Network. So we've worked very extensively with that community. There is significant community benefit funds available to invest in local programmes. So we're down at community council level. We also obviously talk to the local council, but we try and engage all the stakeholders in that area. We've funded, part-funded with our colleagues in SSE who have a renewables connection in that area, a full-time project manager to understand how the best way to spread those benefits in the community. And I know there's others on the West Coast who've done this as well. And we try and be as democratic as possible, but get right underneath and understand the community's drivers so that we can use that money to invest wisely in the projects that they want to see happen. So fully understand the concerns, but we try to do the best that we can with the funds that we've got to spend in that local community to make sure that people do see value in terms of those assets being placed in their local area.
Can I just ask about the 250? Because it's been announced about 100 million across Scotland as a whole. Is that not correct? For the transmission line community benefit?
I don't believe so. Certainly, I can only speak for Central Scotland, and that's the number that we expect to spend on community benefits against the 5-year. SSEN will have a similar number, if not slightly higher, because their overall investment is higher than Scottish Power, so I'd expect that number to be larger. It's because it needs to be released against consentable projects. So the way that you release it, you need to make sure that you have consents in place, or at least clear, before you can release those monies to the community. So it's kind of staged, and it depends on getting those permissions. So as most things in life, it's not straightforward. It's a complicated process, but there is a significant fund available for the communities affected.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Susan Murray.
Thank you. Just really continuing on this a similar topic, but how confident are you that GB Energy plans for community energy are well designed and deliverable?
So I can certainly speak first in terms of the local power plan that was released recently by GB Energy. I think it's ambitious. I think in reality it picks up on a lot of the initiatives that companies like mine already had underway. So we've engaged extensively with community energy schemes, and we have a number connected on our network, both in the transmission area that I operate, but in the wider Scottish Power Energy Networks business, which covers North Wales and Merseyside also. And we've already provided technical support because capacity is sometimes an issue with community energy. So we've workshopped with the community energy schemes and initiatives to take them through the process for connection and the things they need to look for and how to manage a project effectively. We have on our website guidance around that also. So a lot of those initiatives are being kind of promoted and kind of increased, if you like, as part of the local power plan that GB Energy released, I think, in February. So I think that's all the right things, because sometimes it's not only the financing of these projects, it's the actual capability that exists in the local community to actually deliver these projects locally and understand the benefits and also reap the rewards. So I think we're very supportive, and I think we've demonstrated that by our actions. Again, in terms of the ability to connect to the network, that's really under NESO policy, so I wouldn't comment further than Julian did in the previous panel, but certainly we try and support wherever we can in terms of development of those projects.
Yeah, I think the work they've done is a really good start, and the ambition should be heralded. And I think we can't have too much. I think sometimes we often talk in euphemistic terms, don't we? It's ambitious, but it needs to be, because again there's challenges we need to overcome for people. I think what we certainly see is the importance and a role that we take on, but needs to be done more perhaps, is the joining of dots. So already in this session we've talked about different plans and different aspects, and I think we need to be very careful as an industry and as policymakers, so that, as one unit, as it were, that we're not working in silos. So making sure that the different plans interact with each other, not just in a consultative way, but actually flow through. So are the cost benefits here being taken into account to the investment decisions over here? And certainly that's where we've seen some real progress. Certainly in the last 2 or 3 years, we work with a number of local authorities and cities across the whole of the country. Talked earlier about some of the work that's going on in Glasgow as an example. There's other examples I will follow up with, because conscious of time. But what we see there is public sector organisations working, understanding their communities. Having the trust is really important to deliver these plans, because without that trust, nothing gets off the bit of paper. Working with private capital, bringing that innovation forward is really important. And it's only then, plans are great, but they have to be delivered. And again, that's, I think, the test for not just GB Energy, but for all of us, is that we stop talking about what's going to happen in 5 years and we start delivering it today. And I say that because I'm optimistic. I see it in projects we're involved with. Others will have their examples. But we also see it in other countries where we operate across Europe. This isn't a future in terms of the energy transition, in terms of the difference for homes and businesses, that is theoretical. There are examples where this is being delivered, and there's examples where, we're getting off that kind of, global market roller coaster and putting, people back in control of their energy use making sure that they're warmer at home. We always talk about energy efficiency. Let's talk about people being warm in their homes. That's what we're actually interested in. And if we can put more pounds in their pocket, that's all the better as well. So GB Energy, it's good, the work they're doing. We've got lots of great engagement with them. We're certainly a supporter of what they're trying to do. But we've got to make sure, as I say, and I touched on earlier, every lever is being pulled, not just the big ticket items. And that's not a criticism of them. It's just a watch out for all of us that we need to make sure we attack everything.
And I think it's clear the complexity of the system. SSEN has described itself as a strong advocate for community energy prioritisation into the grid queue. Would some of the projects that you're talking about to directly benefit customers, would it be possible for community energy schemes to put the power straight into those schemes, or does it still have to go via the grid for you to digitally control it?
The scheme I talked about earlier, and I think there was another example there, there's regulatory tweaks you can make. So the scheme I talked about with the primary school, that's a bill credit that's applied. It's almost virtual. It's not changing wires. It's not connecting, big new assets in. So there's variations we can make. And again, lots of great progress with Ofgem. That's where we need their support to make sure that those regulatory barriers aren't in a way, where they're imagined. So these are schemes that are common and in operation across Spain and Portugal, as an example. So we can bring, yes, there are still, of course, huge challenges, but there are also things we can do. And where I talk about using levers and making sure everything's being pulled, we've got to make sure that there's not a rule somewhere. The energy supply code runs to, I think it's 611 pages. There's some innovation, I think, and Ofgem do a great job. We have good engagement with them. I think there's improvements we can all make, and as well as things like the connection queue. What other, again, forgive my repetition, but levers can we pull? So yes, there are projects up and down the country that can bring benefit. And I think too often we look at the two big projects that are too difficult, and we forget to deal with stuff we can change today. So if we change the stuff today, we'll get to the hard problems in tomorrow. And again, for your constituents, our customers, we ain't getting to tomorrow unless we take them with us and ensure that the benefits are flowing into their pockets, whether that's a business. We talked earlier about the challenges in the industrial sector. There's changes we need to make now, because otherwise we'll all be sat here in 10 years having a similar conversation.
Because what I picked up from NESO was that actually the community energy generation schemes are actually an additional challenge for them, as opposed to seeing them as a particular benefit. Yeah. Whereas I think people's general conception about community generation is that they will benefit from it. They will absolutely get that power, and therefore they don't need to take power from the grid. But so do you think that is going to be the future? And as you say, do you think that could be introduced more quickly?
Yes and yes.
Thank you.
Angus MacDonald.
It's a great short answer, because we've got about 5 minutes left. In 2014, the Scottish Government set guidance for onshore wind of £5,000 plus an index-linked increase. If you take that £5,000 and you move that forward to today, that comes out at £8,000. 3 weeks ago, the Scottish Government reset its guidance for £6,000, i.e. a 25% reduction on cumulative benefit versus one which would have been done in 2014. The second thing they didn't do is they didn't include pump storage. And for example, the Highlands is expected to have in the region of 5 gigawatts, twice Scotland's demand for energy, of pump storage for electricity. Do you not think that we're having a retrospective move, i.e. Scotland's doing less well out of community benefits than anybody thought possible 10 or 15 years ago?
I'll let others answer the very direct point. What I would say from an E.ON Next perspective, because of the projects we're involved with in terms of being in customers' homes and at businesses, not large-scale generation in that respect, we certainly very much believe and see the advantage and benefits of making sure that those people you're working with and serving get the benefits.
Can I take that for granted? Because I know what you do. What I'd like to know is Highland Council have proposed £12,000 rather than the £6,000. Shetland Council proposed 5% of gross revenue, which is also about £12,000. I've been pushing that for a year and a half. I think that the Scottish Government, doing it at half the price people outside the energy industry were suggesting, is not looking after the communities who are generating this energy. Do you think that's correct or not?
I think in terms of the detail, I think that's one that it needs to be looked at from a policy perspective. But certainly, as a general point, we definitely see the benefits of helping our customers and them feeling a direct benefit. It's important that we talk about climate, but the biggest difference that we make to people's lives and businesses is managing to cut their bills, and therefore they are feeling the benefit. So in terms of specifics, I think that's a kind of different point from the projects we're involved with, but we certainly see that, serving 5.5 million customers across the UK, definitely them feeling the benefit is important. I think others might have a view, but
I don't really. I guess, I mean, it's not my area, and I guess the previous panel might be a better place to answer that. All I would say is that I recognise the concerns of community-based organisations and their ability to connect to the grid. I think that will be relieved somewhat once we get through this huge process that we're right in the middle of with regard to queue reform, and we see more demand coming onto the system. I think that will free up the ability to connect more readily in some of the restrictions that are there at the moment, and that means that there'll be a better opportunity for community-based organisations to get better visibility and hopefully quicker connection to the network. That's all I could comment on in terms
That's
of...
fine. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you all very much indeed. That's been very interesting again, and it's been very helpful to us for our deliberations. So thank you for making the time to be with us today. Thank you.